Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and today I am making a variation of my smocked sides dress. Now, if you haven't seen my first video about this dress, then I will link it in the description, but the main thing you need to know is that it is made from a woven fabric, but with panels of smocking inserted into the sides to allow the dress to be put on and off without needing a zipper. In the past, I've always done this with a single printed fabric, but this time I am trying making it with like a solid bodice and then a printed skirt. And I'll also be adding sleeves, which is something I've only tried once with this style dress, and it didn't work for reasons completely unrelated to the smocking and just having to do with the way my pattern was done in general. So the fabric for this dress, for the skirt, I found this really pretty full cotton quilting fabric, and I actually saw it at the store before I was ready to work on this dress and before I figured out how much fabric I needed. But I went ahead and got it because Mom said, you know, they may not have it by the time you're ready to do it, and it's a good thing that I listened to her because by the time I was ready to do this, they did not have it anymore. And then for the top, I just chose the closest matching solid cotton fabric that I could find, which is a Kona cotton. I believe it's broadcloth. So out of the solid fabric, I just cut out the front and back bodice pieces, as well as the neckline facing and the sleeves. And these were pretty easy, like standard for the pattern pieces. And so were the front and back skirt pieces, which I cut out of the floral fabric. I actually had the width that I needed for each of the skirt panels written down on my pattern, and then I just had to calculate the length based on what I wanted for the skirt, which was a bit of a longer skirt. But last thing to cut out is the side panels. Now, this is the part that's completely new. In the original dress, this panel, it runs the length from under the arms all the way to the hem of the skirt. But because for this one, I needed the top of it to be solid to match the bodice and the bottom of it to be the print to match the skirt, I couldn't do that. So what I did instead, on the pattern, I had written down the width of this panel as well because that also stays the same. And so I cut out two pieces of solid fabric that width that I had written down. And then for the length, I just measured the side seam of the bodice. And I actually had that written also on my pattern because that was part of the formula for calculating like the longer side panel if I was doing it that way. And then from the printed fabric, it's also the same width. And then for the length, it's just the length of the skirt. So actually a little easier in a way than the other one because there wasn't a lot of math involved. It just took some thinking to kind of translate it from one to another because I hadn't really sat down and thought that through before. And if you're wondering about the width that I keep referring to, I didn't give that measurement here because it's very specific to my pattern, and so it wouldn't do anybody any good. But if you're wondering how I came up with that and all of that, that is all in the original video about this style dress. So now I took the solid piece of the side panel and sewed it to the printed piece of the side panel. And then I serged that raw edge and pressed the seam down towards the printed fabric and away from the solid fabric. So now it's time to smock these side panels. So I pulled out my smocking pleater and I pleat the entire length of the solid fabric. So from that raw edge of the solid fabric down to that seam. Normally when I do this, I pay very close attention to where the top pleating needle is in relation to the raw edge of the fabric, the top edge of the fabric. But in this case, I really wanted that last row of pleating to be as close to the waist seam as possible. So that seam between the solid fabric and the printed fabric. So instead of paying attention to the top needle, I just paid a lot of attention to the bottom needle, getting it as close as I could without crossing that seam, because as soon as I did, that would be getting into the seam allowance from where I sewed that, and that would just be too bulky to go through the machine. That's why I pressed it down and away, because if it went through the machine, it would most likely break one of my needles. Once the panels had gone through the pleater and come off, I tied those pleating rows to the appropriate size, which again is written on my pattern and explained in my other video. I then evened out the pleats and ran some steam over the panels to block them. Once they cooled, it was time to start smocking. Now, when I bought my fabric, I forgot to get matching embroidery floss, so I had to go through my stash, and about the only thing I had that kind of matched was this purple embroidery floss. So I just decided to use that because I already had it. So I use a cable stitch and smock that along each row of pleating threads. And I made sure at the rows closest to the waist and that seam that I just kind of smocked those really tightly, like pulling my stitches tight, because I have found that near the waist there's usually more stress put on it, so it's more likely to stretch out right there. And also because to me something about that seam just made it seem a little bulkier right there at the waist than normal, and the tighter smocking seemed to help that. And I also back smocked, I believe it was the bottom 3 rows, for the same reasons. Once all of the rows were done, I just blocked them again, and then it was time for the actual assembly to start. For the bodice, this meant sewing the darts on the front bodice piece, and then sewing the front and back pieces together at the shoulder seams, and doing the same for the neckline facing. I then attached the facing to the bodice before clipping the curved edge and flipping the facing to the inside. Then I gathered and attached the front and back skirt pieces to the bodice. And now back to the side panels. The first thing I did was remove the pleating threads. Then I attached those to the dress along the front and back side seams. And I just made sure to line up the skirt hem and the waist seams. And finally the sleeves. I just sewed the underarm seam and then ran a gathering thread around the top so that I could ease the top of the sleeve when I set it into the bodice armholes. And this was more difficult than usual for a few reasons. When you attach sleeves this way by insetting it into the already fully sewn bodice, you usually line that underarm seam of the sleeve up with the side seam of your bodice. But because my center side seam is not there because I have that inserted pleated insert, I kind of had to estimate where that was, and then the pleated insert does change the shape of the armhole just a little. I tried when I drafted this to not let it change it too much, but there are still some slight changes, so that was just a little more difficult. I had to take it a little more slowly when setting the sleeves in. And that was the last of my machine sewing. I chose to hand sew the skirt hem, the sleeve hems, and the neckline facing because just like the embroidery floss, I forgot to buy matching sewing thread. So I just figured it would look better if I hand stitched it, because then the thread didn't have to match quite as well as it would if I was doing it on the machine. Thank you for watching. If you want a more detailed explanation of this dress and the designing of the pattern, you can check out my first video. It should be on screen or linked in the description, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.